This is Franklin Rye. Welcome back to Political Spirits, the podcast that remains committed to its belief that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. We just need to talk. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's start with another one of my lobbying stories or lobbying anecdotes. In Episode 5, Turning Point, I told a few stories about my years in governmental affairs. One of those was regarding the fact that you can lobby on the floor of the Louisiana House of Representatives by entering a roped-off area in the back of the chamber and then having the sergeant-at-arms bring you the representatives you request if they're willing to talk to you. As I noted, two amusing aspects of that particular option were that you couldn't talk until the legislators entered the roped-off area, and the lobbyists against which you were competing could have associates listening in on your arguments while you were totally unaware of it and then rebutting them later. As a result, I had to keep my head on a swivel as I was speaking to try to figure out if anybody was listening in. So I'm pretty well occupied making my presentations and keeping an eye out for listening lobbyists. But I still managed to notice one eye-opening aspect of the legislature at that time. At the time that I was doing this, David Duke, the Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard, had recently been elected to the State House of Representatives. To the embarrassment of the Republican Party, he ran as a Republican and managed to get elected in his single district. I had watched the media coverage of that issue with great interest and dismay. I was not from Louisiana, but I certainly did not want a Klansman elected to the legislature of any state, and I was concerned about the adverse impact that event would have on the Republican Party because he ran as a Republican. Anyone watching the media coverage of that election and its aftermath would come away thinking that David Duke was an active member of the Republican Party with influence at least on par with that of other freshman legislators. Because he was a freshman legislator, he was sitting at the back of the chamber. His desk was probably not more than 8 feet away from where I was standing in the roped-off area. I looked over, and the thought that ran through my head was, "Holy shit, that's David Duke." Now I'm left trying to give convincing arguments, keep an eye out for competing lobbyists trying to listen in to my presentations, and being unable to turn away from the fact that the leader of a domestic terrorist organization, the KKK, is sitting 8 feet away from me. In the end, I stood there in the roped-off area making points for hours to various legislators, and I couldn't help but observe David Duke throughout that period. This was long before anyone started using the phrase fake news, but I was struck by the difference between the impression you would get of David Duke's prominence within the party and the reality on display over those hours in the House chambers. Legislator after legislator was approached by the sergeant-at-arms staff and brought on request to the roped-off area to speak with lobbyists. Legislator after legislator would get up and walk over and sit down and stand with other legislators to discuss whatever they wished throughout the course of the day. But despite the many hours that I was there on the floor of the chambers, not once did any lobbyists ask the sergeant-at-arms to bring David Duke to the roped-off area. Not once did any legislator walk over to talk to David Duke. Not once did David Duke get up and walk over to talk with any other legislator. What I saw was a member of the Louisiana House of Representatives who wasn't simply of little influence because he was a freshman legislator, but rather a legislator who had no influence at all, because there was no interest in anyone to talk to him. And he apparently had no interest in talking with anyone else. Or perhaps he knew that nobody would talk to him even if he approached them. Those few hours helped to establish my understanding of why we should never place too much stock in what the news media tells us. The best we can do is go to multiple sites with differing viewpoints and take it all with a grain of salt. Next topic. What is the left thinking? Well, frankly, I want to talk about what on earth is the Democratic Party doing to the interest groups that are its base. As I noted in the pilot episode, identity politics is doing great damage to the country. As I noted in the episode Self-Censoring Public, people are not objecting to biological males participating as transgender females in women's athletics for fear of being labeled transphobic. In that episode, I specifically addressed transgender athletes at the high school level in the Connecticut State Track and Field Championships. I'll state again what I stated then, that I have the utmost sympathy for anyone who suffers from gender dysphoria. I can't even imagine how difficult it must be to live each day thinking that you're in the wrong body. However, as I said in the previous episode, my sympathy does not mean that I must agree with the public policy proposals of transgender advocacy groups. Well, recently there was another instance of a biological male participating as a transgender female in an athletic contest and winning a championship. In this instance, the contest was the 2018 UCI Masters Track Cycling World Championships in Los Angeles. The transgender athlete won the gold medal in the 35 to 39 age category. I went into detail in the episode Self-Censoring Public regarding the unfairness of transgender females competing against athletes who were born biologically male. Frankly, the 3 points I made that went into great detail in the context of sprinting contests are undeniable. Much of the points made in that episode apply to cycling events as well, including the presence in men of increased volumes of hemoglobin, larger heart, larger lungs, and larger body size. Additionally, because male hips on average are narrower than women's, the quadriceps muscle runs in more of a straight line, providing a propulsion advantage. What makes this most recent instance of a transgender female winning the championship in an athletic contest stand out is the argument that the winner makes regarding the fairness of her being allowed to compete against biological women. Her argument, as stated in USA Today in January, is, "We cannot have a woman legally recognized as a trans woman in society and not recognized that way in sports." She went further, focusing on, and this is a quote, "focusing on performance advantage is largely irrelevant because this is a rights issue. We shouldn't be worried about trans people taking over the Olympics. We should be worried about their fairness and human rights instead." Close quote. That argument undermines the point of athletic contests. The reason why we have winners and losers, the reason why we keep score, is that we can see who is the better athlete and who worked the hardest and made the smartest decisions on the field or the basketball court or in the velodrome. That's why we separate the male athletes from the female athletes, so that the competition will actually determine the athletically best man or woman. If we simply combined the men and the women, the male athletes would dominate to the point that there would be virtually no chance for the female athletes making it to the podium in numerous sports. That's not a sexist comment. It's a fact. See the episode Self-Censoring Public for the scientific details. Also, the Daily Wire, in its October 15 article covering the story, noted that another transgender competitor, who competes at a higher level than McKinnon, who won this contest, has argued with McKinnon, acknowledging that the inherent sex differences between men and women make competing against biological women unfair. That transgender athlete also stated that, quote, "I've proven how powerful testosterone is when I competed," close quote, as a male. I understand the fear of the public that they will be labeled transphobes for objecting to the trans athlete's unfair advantage. Perhaps my favorite quote from Ms. McKinnon regarding those who question her win is this one from Velo News on October 15, 2018. Perhaps my favorite quote from Ms. McKinnon regarding those who question her win is this one from Velo News, October 15, 2018 edition. Quote, "It's not the case that all trans women are these big 6-foot-tall, 200-pound powerlifters. I happen to be a 6-foot-tall, 200-pound powerlifter, but that's beside the point." Close quote. Need I say more? She actually makes the point for me. By the way, since the event, the third-place finisher, Jennifer Wagner, has complained that it's not fair to allow a transgender female to compete against biological females. Ms. McKinnon promptly labeled critics such as Ms. Wagner as, quote, transphobic bigots, close quote. As reported in Fox News by writer Caleb Park on October 21, Ms. McKinnon also asserted that Wagner could be subjected to sanctions for violating the sponsoring organization's policy against harassment for, quote, creating hostile environments or disparaging remarks against people on the basis of gender identity, close quote. The Democratic Party has become so invested in supporting all of the many demographic divisions into which they have split themselves, and they've split the country, that they're undermining some to support others. Their unfettered support of transgender athletes has thrown biological female athletes in their coalition under the proverbial bus, as we face a future where increasingly females will be placed in the unfair and in some instances unwinnable athletic contests with transgender females. Frankly, I think the Democrats are crazy to put themselves in that position. If there's one thing that's crystal clear about this issue, is that there are a heck of a lot more biological women than there are individuals with gender dysphoria. That doesn't mean the Democrats have to make decisions which are more favorable to women in general than they are to persons with gender dysphoria, but it does mean Democrats should be very careful when they support competition of transgender athletes based on the gender with which they identify, rather than the biological gender on which they were born, thereby placing athletes who are biologically female at a competitive disadvantage. If you significantly lower the percentage of women who vote Democrat, the party cannot win. That cannot be said as to transgender individuals voting Democrat. But the reason I'm so aggravated by this issue is not because it has the potential to harm the Democratic Party, but rather because I've been a supporter of women's sports for much of my life. I told you that I'd let you know when specific aspects of my background factor into my conclusions. Well, where I grew up, the local high school won the girls' state basketball championship. I was there in the crowd for the finals cheering them on. Later, I became a big fan of the Tennessee Lady Vols and their Hall of Fame legendary coach, Pat Summitt. I think back to all those incredible teams that she had when she won national championship after national championship. Think about what she had on her team when the three Meeks were together on a single team: Chamique Holtzclaw, Tamika Catchings, and Samika Randall. You can at least make an argument that Chamique Holtzclaw may be the best women's basketball player of all time. She ended up with more points and rebounds in her career than anyone else in Tennessee history, more points and rebounds than anyone else in SEC women's history, and more points and rebounds than anyone else in NCAA women's tournament history. She was Player of the Year in college twice, and was the WNBA Rookie of the Year and a member of the gold medal-winning Olympic team. Now think about the fact that those Lady Vols teams, which included Chamique Holtzclaw, for some time also included Tamika Catchings, a tremendous player in her own right. She was a top performer in both the college ranks and the pros. Incredibly, she's the first player at any level and only the second player ever to have recorded a quintuple double. Specifically, she was in high school when she recorded in a single game 25 points, 18 rebounds, 11 assists, 10 steals, and 10 blocks. That'll do. Now add to that the fact that the Lady Vols teams, which included Chamique Holtzclaw and Tamika Catchings, also included Samika Randall, who ended her career as the Lady Vols' seventh leading scorer and a two-time All-American, but was best known as being an extremely aggressive defensive player. Now take the 1998 team, with the three Meeks that went 39-0, won the national championship, and won their regular season games by an average of 31.2 points per game. That was the best women's basketball team I have ever seen. Now consider how that team would do against a team made up of top-notch transgender female basketball players. It hasn't happened yet, but it will. Eventually, in women's basketball, a top-notch male athlete will identify as a female. How long will it take before that happens? I have no idea. But it already happened with an athlete who was the world's greatest decathlete, Bruce Jenner. But she did not become Caitlyn Jenner until long past the period when, as Bruce Jenner, he competed in athletic competitions. Imagine for a moment if LeBron James announced that he wished to transition to a woman. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that is likely to happen. There's absolutely nothing to indicate that LeBron James suffers from gender dysphoria. But what if he did? Can you imagine the level of domination he would have in the WNBA? There's already a transgender female MMA fighter. What happens in women's boxing if a boxer at the level of a George Foreman or Larry Holmes, or one of the Klitschko brothers in their prime, or even the waning parts of their careers, announce that they identified as a woman? I'm not saying athletes would do so when they really didn't identify as a woman. I'm just saying that eventually it will happen. Can you imagine someone the size of George Foreman or Vladimir Klitschko beating women to a pulp in the boxing ring? I can't, and I'm a boxing fan. I don't ever want to see it. But in the direction we're heading, it could happen. And the support that the left is giving to the transgender athlete issue is accelerating the day when it will happen. What are they doing? So what's the other instance where I wonder what on earth are the Democrats doing? It's the issue of falsely claiming minority status. I thought that we were over this when Rachel Dolezal, who claimed that she was black, even though she was so fair-skinned in her youth that she looked like an Irish waif in a Cranberries video, but then obviously engaged in extensive tanning and hair treatments. When she was eventually caught, she had to give up her position at the local NAACP. When I first learned that Elizabeth Warren had been touted as a Native American professor at Harvard and other institutions, but she was unable to provide support for that designation and simply stated that she understood that there were Native Americans in her family ancestry and she had high cheekbones, my reaction was, this is outrageous, and there's no way she'll ever climb higher than her Senate position because of the issue. Incredibly, last week Elizabeth Warren tried to claim that a supposed expert that she retained had been able to determine that she had a Native American relative 6 to 10 generations removed from her, and that somehow resolved the issue. Think about what this means. If it's true that Elizabeth Warren may have a Native American ancestor, that ancestor means that she may be between 132nd and 1024th Native American. That doesn't come close to showing that she's a Native American. In fact, the number is so minuscule that multiple publications have noted it's a lower percentage of Native American ancestry than the typical Caucasian American. That Elizabeth Warren was touted by Harvard and others as a minority hire and a Native American professor is disappointing, to say the least. We can all debate issues related to diversity, but the one thing about which there should be no debate and only agreement, it is absolutely wrong to claim to be a minority when in fact you are not. Doing so is an affront to minorities, including the minority members of the Democrat coalition. And frankly, it's going to be a big issue if Elizabeth Warren really does run for the presidency. Among other things, it will be another example of the Democrat Party undermining one demographic group in its coalition in pursuit of power. Next topic. Quick election update. In Episode 5, Turning Point, I said that I thought that the U.S. Senate election was moving from one in which the Republicans would likely pick up 1 or maybe 2 seats to one in which they would pick up 3 or more. Since that time, I've noticed that the Real Clear Politics average of polls has moved their projection for the Senate from one in which the Republicans would simply maintain their bare majority to one in which they would gain 1 seat. Then it moved to 2 seats. More recently, the Real Clear Politics average of polls now says that they project the GOP to pick up 3 seats in the Senate. Obviously, there's no guarantee that 3 seats will in fact be picked up, and the projection could also change between now and the election. But it's interesting and encouraging that the Real Clear Politics average of polls, and it is an average which depends on multiple polls, which lends it additional credibility, is now showing results which are in line with my prediction. As to the question of whether the Republicans will be able to hold the House, that is still very much up in the air. Historically, you would expect that they will in fact lose control of the House. Certainly the commentators and political analysts seem to have concluded that they will in fact lose it. Given that the Real Clear Politics average of polls for generic support for Republicans or Democrats for Congress shows the Democrats with a 7.6% advantage, that would tend to indicate that the Democrats will in fact take the House of Representatives. But some articles recently have started to focus on polling specifically in battleground districts. Their results show that the Democratic advantage ranges from 1% to 4%. That may be an indication that we're looking at the potential for miniature versions of the presidential election in individual congressional districts. In other words, just as Hillary Clinton was able to win the popular vote by piling up massive margins of victory in California and New York City, especially in the greater Los Angeles and San Francisco-Oakland Bay areas, when all she really needed to do was win by 1, but then losing by smaller margins in battleground states, we may see a situation where Democrats win congressional seats in urban areas by large margins and then lose multiple seats in more rural areas by smaller margins, thus making the generic 7.6% ballot lead an indicator not of taking the House, but rather of taking safe seats by incredibly large margins, but losing the at-risk ones by small ones. Should such an event occur, it may result in the Republicans holding the House. We'll have to wait and see. Next topic. First Man Movie Review. I recently saw the movie First Man. I actually had to think twice about going because I was a bit bothered by the fact that the film did not depict the planting of the American flag, and there was quite a controversy about that. At this point, I should warn you with a mild spoiler alert. In the end, the fact that they didn't depict the planting of the American flag is not as big of an issue as the media reports implied. The flag was shown in multiple ways, including on the crew uniforms and the distant shot on the moon showing the flag already planted rather than the act of planting it itself. From a political perspective, the one thing that stood out to me about the coverage of the flag planting issue and the movie was how much of the media made no mention of the actual reason that I suspect the filmmakers left out the flag planting scene. I think the reason they left it out is because they felt it might undermine the marketability of the film in China. How important is China to Hollywood box office? Well, let's look to the 2017 results as reported in Forbes in an article by Mark Hughes on March 4 of 2017, looking at some of the top-grossing movies for the year. XXX: The Return of Xander Cage earned $332 million worldwide, of which $154 million was from China. Your Name earned a $327 million worldwide return, with just under $85 million from China. Resident Evil: The Final Chapter earned $238 million worldwide, of which $94 million was from China. There were other movies, such as The Great Wall, which not surprisingly earned more money in China than was earned in the rest of the world. The bottom line is that Hollywood cannot afford to ignore China, and I suspect they believe that depicting the planting of the American flag on the moon would not sit well with the Chinese. Is that an annoying fact, if in fact that's the reason they made that decision? Yes. But I can't really fault them for it. The other depictions of the flag in the film are nearly enough to make up for the lack of the planting, and the bottom line is the film has to make money. Speaking of making money, the week-to-week box office for First Man dropped 57%. Why? Is it the flag planting controversy? I don't think so. I think it's because the film is terminally boring. I was expecting to be entertained and uplifted. Instead, I actually fell asleep for a short period twice during the movie. It's kind of funny that I've done several movie reviews from a political perspective in the episodes of this podcast, and on at least 2 occasions I've talked about critics objecting to a lack of reality in the films in question. In this instance, when they made First Man, they chose to actually be very realistic as to Neil Armstrong's nature. He was, in fact, extremely quiet and introverted, and that is exactly how they depicted him, to a fault. With the exception of one moment near the beginning of the film where Armstrong breaks down, and Ryan Gosling does an impressive job of depicting it, I imagine that the director spent much of the film telling Gosling to pretend you're sleepwalking at this point. I appreciate accuracy, but for a subject as exciting and interesting as the Apollo program and the moon landing, it amazed me that at points this film was about as exciting as listening to a high school math teacher recite all the prime numbers. So was there any redeeming part of the film? Yes, as I mentioned, the single emotional portion of Gosling's performance, which I won't detail in case you're going to see the film, and also the actual depicting of the moon landing itself. That part, which was the last 20 or 30 minutes of the movie, was extremely well done in my opinion. It was during that portion of the film that I experienced what I expected to experience throughout the whole movie, which was a sense of how on earth did we manage this in 1969? As I watched the lunar lander racing at high speed over the surface of the moon, while listening to Buzz Aldrin tell Armstrong, "We can't land there, we can't land there, those boulders are the size of cars," you can't help but think, wow, these are two guys in this spaceship with hardly any fuel left, racing over the surface of the moon trying to pick a landing spot by eyesight through a small window while at risk of running out of fuel. You know, I've been on a couple of hot air balloon rides, and it struck me as every bit as manual as that. The balloon is drifting over roads and fields and yards, and you're looking for a clear spot without any big rocks or power lines. The difference is that you're doing it at the speed of a turtle instead of the speed of a fighter plane, and you have great visibility instead of a tiny window. You don't have to worry about craters, and no matter how bad you screw up the landing, there's no way you're going to end up stranded with your balloon 238,900 miles from home. It is that 20 to 30 minutes of the movie that lived up to the billing. For the rest of it, take 2 no-dos before you enter the theater. As for this podcast, I trust no caffeine was required. Please invite your friends and join me next week, alert and awake, for the next episode of Political Spirits. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.